On the 19th of February 1942, 242 Japanese aircraft attacked Darwin. That same day, Winston Churchill was planning how to use the Australian troops sailing home to defend Burma. I spent weeks going through declassified cables between Curtin and Churchill, AWM archives, and official histories of the Pacific Campaign to bring you this documentary. What you're about to hear is the most important diplomatic confrontation in Australian history. 2 leaders, dozens of cables, and 50,000 soldiers in the middle of the Indian Ocean waiting to find out where they were going. Darwin. The 19th of February, 1942. 9:58 in the morning. The first wave. 188 aircraft from 4 Japanese carriers in the Timor Sea. The harbour first. The merchant ships. The destroyers. The rolling explosions that sank at least 8 vessels and killed more than 250 people. The second wave arrived at midday. The RAAF airfield. 20 military aircraft destroyed on the ground. The defensive infrastructure of the only viable port in northern Australia turned to rubble. It was the most destructive attack by a foreign power on Australian mainland territory in the nation's entire history. More aircraft than Pearl Harbor. More ships sunk per sortie than Pearl Harbor. And it wasn't the only one. Between March 1942 and November 1943, Northern Australia suffered between 60 and 100 additional Japanese air raids. Darwin was just the beginning. To understand why the bombing of Darwin produced the effect it did, you need to understand what had happened 4 days earlier. On the 15th of February 1942, Singapore fell. 85,000 Allied soldiers captured, 15,000 of them Australian. Churchill called it the greatest disaster in British military history. In the weeks before, Rabaul had fallen. Timor had been invaded. Java was under attack. The defensive arc that was supposed to protect Australia from the north had disintegrated in weeks. And now Darwin was burning. The threat of Japanese invasion seemed immediate and inevitable to any Australian looking at a map in February 1942. What Australians didn't know what declassified Japanese documents would reveal decades later was that Tokyo never approved a plan to invade Australia. The Japanese objective wasn't to occupy the continent, it was to isolate it, cut its sea lanes, neutralise it as an Allied base. But in February 1942, that distinction changed nothing for an Australian government watching Japanese aircraft over Darwin and a completely exposed northern coastline. John Curtin had been in office since the 7th of October 1941, less than 3 months before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. He wasn't the profile anyone would have chosen to lead Australia through the worst crisis in its history. He had been a union organiser. He had led the anti-conscription movement in the First World War. He was Labour in a country where defence policy had been the preserve of Conservatives for decades. And he governed in minority, sustained by 2 defectors from the Conservative bloc. But Curtin had something no political profile fully captures: clarity. From the moment he took office, his assessment of Australia's strategic situation was simple and brutal. Britain could not defend Australia. It didn't have the resources, it didn't have the will, and the fall of Singapore had demonstrated that with a finality that admitted no alternative interpretation. Australia had to look to itself, and it had to look to the United States. In December 1941, Curtin published an article in the Melbourne Herald that scandalised London and defined the rest of his term. Australia would look to America for its security in the Pacific. Not to Britain, to America. Churchill read it with the composure of someone accustomed to colonies expressing opinions that didn't translate into action. He was wrong. In February 1942, while Darwin burned, 50,000 Australian soldiers were sailing across the Indian Ocean. The 6th Division, the 7th Division, veterans of Libya, of Greece, of Crete, of Syria and Lebanon, the professional corps of the Australian Army, the men who had fought in every imperial theatre of operations since 1940. Curtin had called them home. The February 1942 decision was simple in its statement and monumental in its implications. The 6th and 7th Divisions were returning to Australia, not to another imperial theatre, not to reinforce a British position somewhere on the map that Churchill considered a priority, to Australia, to defend the continent that had been bombed for months while its best soldiers fought other people's wars. Churchill had a different opinion about where those men should go. And what happened when the two leaders collided over that difference in dozens of cables across the Indian Ocean, with 50,000 soldiers in the middle, is what no Australian school history book has told with the clarity it deserves. On the 15th of February 1942, the day Singapore fell in the Pacific War Council, the British put a proposal on the table. The 7th Australian Division, the men sailing home across the Indian Ocean, should go to the most urgent point at that moment: Burma. Not Australia, not to defend the continent that had just been bombed by 242 Japanese aircraft. To Rangoon, to reinforce the British and Indian forces trying to stop the Japanese advance toward the Irrawaddy Valley. Churchill's argument was simple and, from his perspective, completely reasonable. The 7th Australian Division was the only force that could reach Rangoon in time to prevent its fall. If Rangoon fell, the land route to China was cut. Chiang Kai-shek's forces were isolated. The eastern flank of India was exposed. And losing India meant losing the jewel of the British imperial crown at the moment when the empire had already lost Hong Kong, Malaya and Singapore. Churchill added one more argument. Roosevelt backed the request. The two most powerful leaders in the Allied world were telling John Curtin that his army had to go to Burma. Curtin responded on the 18th of February. No. It wasn't a provisional refusal. It wasn't a request for more information. It wasn't the diplomatic deference Churchill expected from a Prime Minister of a Commonwealth nation when London expressed a strategic preference. It was a no. The Australian government could not accept the diversion to Burma. The divisions had to return to Australia. Churchill processed that and made a decision that would define the rest of the confrontation. He ignored the refusal. Not formally, not with a direct order that could be diplomatically contested. He simply instructed the British Navy to change the convoy's course, toward Rangoon, via Colombo, without Australian authorization, without waiting for Canberra to change its position, treating the approval of the Australian government as something to be obtained afterwards, as a formality. The ships turned. Thousands of Australian soldiers sailing north across the Indian Ocean, not knowing their Prime Minister had said they shouldn't go to that destination. Not knowing their government hadn't authorised the change, of course. Not knowing they were being taken toward a city that would fall within weeks. And exposing themselves, on that alternative route, to Japanese naval patrols they wouldn't have encountered had they continued on the original heading. Churchill had made a decision about Australian soldiers without asking Australia's permission. Churchill wasn't alone in this position. Roosevelt had agreed with him at the Arcadia Conference on the Germany First policy, Europe First, Japan Second. And in that framework, sustaining Burma, keeping open the route to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese, was an American priority as much as a British one. Roosevelt conveyed his support. Directly or indirectly, the two most powerful leaders in the Allied world let the same suggestion drop. If Australia didn't cooperate, it might see reduced Allied support for its own defence. It was the maximum pressure available. And it had a fundamental problem. MacArthur was in Australia. The Allied counter-offensive in the Pacific was going to be launched from Australia. A defenceless Australia wasn't just an Australian problem. It was an American problem of the first magnitude. Curtin knew it. And when Roosevelt assessed the situation with the pragmatism of a president who had to win a war in the Pacific, he arrived at the same conclusion Curtin had reached from the beginning. Australia first. If this story is pulling you in, now is the time to subscribe to the channel. Every week we publish documentaries about the Australian military stories that history books don't tell. One click. And you won't miss any of them. Between January and February 1942, 4 to 5 significant cable exchanges crossed between Canberra and London that Australian historians describe as the most important diplomatic confrontation in the country's history. Not a single cable. Not a single dramatic moment. A sequence. On the 17th of January, Curtin writes to Churchill demanding the return of the Australian divisions. On the 15th of February, Singapore falls. On the 17th of February, the British propose in the War Council that the 7th Division go to Burma. On the 18th of February, Curtin says no. On the 22nd of February, Curtin reiterates with maximum force that the divisions are going to Australia. On the 23rd of February, Curtin discovers the convoy has been diverted without his consent, and writes the cable that the archives preserve as the breaking point of the entire confrontation. The National Archives of Australia preserve the draft of the 23rd of February cable. It cannot be reproduced word for word, but its content is documented with enough precision that every historian who has read it says the same thing about it. It was an accusation, not a diplomatic complaint. Curtin told Churchill 3 things with a clarity that no diplomatic protocol could fully soften. First, the Australian government had not consented to the convoy's diversion. London had treated its approval as a mere formality. That was unacceptable. Second, if anything happened to the convoy while sailing toward Rangoon instead of toward Australia, the political responsibility was Churchill's, not Canberra's. Third, Australia had already paid the price of trusting that this time there would be adequate air support. In Greece, in Crete, in Malaya, in Singapore. It was not going to pay that price again in Burma. The 3 words historians cite most from that cable are the simplest. As in Greece. 3 words that said everything that needed to be said. That Curtin wasn't refusing a reasonable strategic request. He was refusing a pattern that had cost Australia thousands of men in theatres where the Empire had sent them with promises that weren't kept. And that wouldn't be kept in Burma either. Churchill responded, with firm but courteous tone in the early cables, defending that global priorities required distributing resources where the danger was greatest. That, in the long run, this also protected Australia. That the 7th Division was the only available force that could reach Rangoon in time. And he added the most direct pressure he had available. Roosevelt backed the request. The 2 most powerful leaders in the Allied world telling Curtin to give way, letting drop that an Australian refusal could cool Allied commitment to Australia's defence. It was the maximum pressure 2 powers could apply on the Prime Minister of a small nation. And Curtin processed it and responded with something Churchill hadn't anticipated. The complete inversion of imperial logic. Australia was no longer an imperial resource available to be distributed according to London's priorities. It was a sovereign state that prioritised its own survival, and its support for the Empire was conditioned by that priority, not the other way around. Curtin articulated it with the precision of someone who had spent weeks thinking in exactly these terms. Keeping Australia strong was the country's best contribution to the Allied effort, because Australia was the base from which the counteroffensive against Japan would be launched. Destroying that base by sending its best divisions to Burma wasn't Allied strategy. It was the sacrifice of the most important Allied base in the South Pacific to plug another imperial hole. And in that argument was the only thing Churchill couldn't refute. That MacArthur was in Australia. That the Allied counteroffensive in the Pacific was going to be launched from Australia. That a defenceless Australia wasn't just an Australian problem. It was an American problem. And Roosevelt, however much he formally backed Churchill, couldn't ignore that. Churchill yielded. The convoy was diverted to Colombo, resupplied in Ceylon, and continued toward Australia. Not toward Rangoon. The troops arrived in March 1942. Rangoon fell on the 8th of March. 10 days. The soldiers who, thanks to Curtin, disembarked in Adelaide and defended Kokoda and Bunagona would have been captured in a Burmese city falling a week and a half after their arrival. Curtin made no public statement about what he had achieved. It wasn't his style. But what had happened in those cables crossing the Indian Ocean between January and February 1942 had changed something that the British Empire took years to fully process. That Australia was no longer a resource available for redistribution. It was a sovereign state making its own strategic decisions. And it had proved it by saying no to Churchill and Roosevelt simultaneously. And winning. But the confrontation didn't end in February 1942. It started again in October. This time with the 9th Division. On the 23rd of October 1942, the British 8th Army launched the Second Battle of El Alamein, the offensive that would change the course of the North Africa campaign. And at the centre of that offensive, as the pivot of the entire British effort, was the 9th Australian Division, the same men who had held the Tobruk perimeter for 241 days, who had held out against everything Rommel threw at that defensive position when everyone else was leaving. Now attacking, winning. With 2,700 casualties in 12 days of combat that AWM archives describe as some of the most intense of the entire African campaign. On the 29th of October 1942, 6 days after the start of El Alamein, with the battle still in progress, John Curtin sent a cable to Churchill. Most immediate, most secret, the most urgent classifications available in the Allied communications system. The 9th Division had to return to Australia. Churchill had arguments that, in any other circumstance, would have been irrefutable. The 9th Division was the pivot of El Alamein. Withdrawing it mid-battle was unthinkable. It was the most battle-hardened unit in the theatre. Replacing it required moving another division from another front, a transport commitment that operations against Germany couldn't absorb. And then there was the argument Churchill considered definitive. Abadan. The Persian oil fields. The fuel source sustaining the entire Allied war machine in the Mediterranean. If the 9th Division left and the Middle East defensive setup weakened, Abadan was exposed. And without Abadan, the war against Germany was complicated in ways no alternative plan could compensate. Germany first. The agreement with Roosevelt. The absolute priority of defeating Germany before Japan. And for that, the North Africa Front was critical. And for the North Africa Front, the 9th Division was indispensable. 3 chained arguments, each supporting the next. Churchill presented them with the confidence of someone who had seen Curtin yield in February 1942. That Curtin hadn't yielded in February was a detail Churchill seemed to have forgotten. Curtin's response arrived with the same clarity as all his previous cables. Australia depended on the return of the 9th Division. It had to come back as soon as possible. As an intact Australian force not filled with British soldiers or contingents from other countries. Australian. Complete. And he would not send reinforcements to the 9th in Africa to compensate for its withdrawal. But what made the October cable different from February's was something the archives capture between the lines. Curtin didn't trust Churchill, not as a diplomatic statement, as a practical assessment based on what had happened 8 months earlier. In February, Churchill had ignored the Australian no and ordered the convoy diverted anyway. Curtin hadn't forgotten that. And in October, with the 9th Division in the middle of North Africa and the transports under British control, the possibility of Churchill trying the same thing again wasn't abstract. That's why the 29th of October cable left no room for interpretation. Most immediate, most secret, not a request, not a preference expressed with the usual diplomatic courtesy, a demand. On the 4th of November 1942, El Alamein ended. Rommel in retreat. The Afrika Korps destroyed as an offensive force. The North Africa campaign taking a turn that would make Churchill call it the end of the beginning. And with that victory, Churchill's central argument for retaining the 9th Division evaporated. By late November 1942, Churchill wrote to Curtin, "In accordance with your wishes, he would recommend to the President that the 9th Division return to Australia as soon as possible." As soon as possible. The same formula of deference he had used in February, the concession that came after Curtin's pressure, had proved irresistible. Operation Pamphlet organised the evacuation. On the 23rd of January, 1943, the 9th Division left Egypt. The transports arrived in Australia in February and March 1943. The last major AIF contingent in North Africa had come home. Churchill had yielded, for the second time, in the same pattern, to the same man. The men of the 9th Division who arrived in Australia in February 1943 had fought in terrain that couldn't be more different from what awaited them. Desert, dry heat, visibility for kilometres, tanks and artillery on open ground. The Papua New Guinea jungle was a completely different world. But they retrained, and in 1943 were sent to New Guinea, Lae, Finschhafen. Amphibious operations on the northern Papua coast that were part of the Great Allied Offensive to expel the Japanese from the southwestern Pacific. The same men who had been the pivot of El Alamein became the assault force of Australian amphibious operations in the Pacific. And in 1945, in Borneo, they completed the most extraordinary arc of any Commonwealth division in the Second World War. Tobruk, El Alamein, New Guinea, Borneo, 4 completely different theatres, 4 completely different types of combat. The same division that Churchill wanted to keep in North Africa, that Curtin brought home, that defended Australia and finished the war at the other end of the Pacific. If you look at the 2 confrontations between Curtin and Churchill, February 1942 over the 7th Division and October 1942 over the 9th, what you see isn't 2 separate incidents. It's the same conflict twice. Churchill using the same arguments. The division in question is indispensable. The theatre where it is critical. The transports can't be diverted. Germany first requires it. Curtin responding with the same logic. The Japanese threat to Australia is real. His troops fight where Australia decides. The primary obligation is the defence of the continent. And the same result. Churchill yielding. What that reveals isn't just Curtin's firmness. It's something about the balance of power within the alliance that nobody had articulated so clearly before 1942. That Britain needed Australia as much as or more than Australia needed Britain. That the empire that had treated its dominions as resources available to be redistributed according to London's priorities could no longer do so. Not with this Prime Minister. Not with this army. Not with this country that had decided its soldiers fought where Australia decided they should fight. John Curtin died on the 5th of July 1945. 3 weeks before Japan surrendered, exhausted by years of decisions that no political office should require of a single man. By sleepless nights calculating how to defend a continent with the resources of a small nation. By the confrontations with Churchill. By the cables to Roosevelt. By the casualty reports arriving from Kokoda, from Milne Bay, from Lae. He didn't live to see the end of the war that had defined his term. But the soldiers he brought home did. And that was exactly what Curtin had said was his primary obligation. Bring them home. And he did. There's something about this story that the school history books don't fully capture. Not the diplomatic victory. Not the 50,000 soldiers who arrived in Adelaide in March 1942. Not the line running from those cables to the Anzac Treaty of 1951. It's this. A Prime Minister of Australia who had been an anti-war union organiser, who governed in minority, who had been in office 4 months when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, told Winston Churchill no. Told Franklin Roosevelt no. And when Churchill ignored that no and ordered the convoy diverted anyway, Curtin wrote a cable that said one thing with a clarity that needed no translation. Send them back. The men who fought at Kokoda, who stopped the Japanese at Milne Bay, who defended Australia when nobody else was looking toward Australia. They were the same men Churchill wanted to send to Burma, and that Curtin brought home. If this channel is telling you stories you haven't heard before, subscribe now. We're a small channel building something big. Every subscriber matters, and the next documentary is already ready. There's another story just as buried as this one. Another moment when Australia had to choose between obeying a more powerful ally and defending its own survival, in a different theatre, with consequences that also changed something bigger than a single battle. It's in the next video.